Hi, I'm Joe Welinske, and I am the principal of Welinske and Associates. And one of the things that we have coming up is our Writers UA East event for content pros coming up in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so I get the chance to talk with our many presenters and kind of get to know them, and you're able to do that as well. So today I'm fortunate to be talking with Everett McKay. Hello, Everett. How are you doing today?
Very well. Thanks, Joe.
I'm speaking from Seattle, Washington. Where are you talking to us from?
I am speaking to you from beautiful St. Albans, Vermont.
St. Albans, Vermont. So what's it like in St. Albans, Vermont today?
Well, it depends on the day. I actually haven't been outdoors yet, so I can't tell you, but we've had quite a range. It's been, hot and miserable for a few days and very cool and pleasant on others, so you have to pick your day.
And what's a good reason to be living in St. Albans, Vermont? I'm not familiar with it.
Well, it's kind of a personal story, but it kind of boils down to my wife is from Quebec, and so when we decided to get married, it was Vermont was kind of our compromise between California and Montreal, and turned out to be a good choice. I actually like living the rural lifestyle very much.
Yeah, I've liked visiting it too.
Yeah, it's a different way of living.
Well, you've obviously been really busy in your career, writing books, intuitive design, UI's communication. I've been fortunate to know you for a while, but probably there may be people that are watching this that aren't as familiar with your background. So maybe talk a little bit about what you've done in the past and the nature of your work as it goes on right now.
All right, very good. So one thing that's a little unusual about me, believe it or not, is I got into UX design not as a designer but as a programmer. So early on in my career as a developer, I just appreciated that having a great user experience was the key to success on all the projects that I was working on. So kind of throughout my career, I kind of naturally gravitated towards working on the UI design whenever I had the opportunity. And one thing kind of led to another, and I found myself at Microsoft starting in 2000 as a program manager, originally on Windows Server and then later on Windows Client. And that kind of really made my career in UX formal. But I'm basically self-taught. I kind of had to learn the hard way, but mostly by doing it wrong and seeing other people doing it wrong. And one interesting thing actually two interesting highlights about my career at Microsoft. So I was there about 10 years. I started Windows Server, as I mentioned, doing security UI. I moved over to Windows Client, where I ended up being personally responsible for the Windows user experience guidelines for both Windows Vista and Windows 7. And so I was responsible for writing and driving those throughout the organization as well as with third parties. And another interesting thing that just purely happened by accident is probably a mutual friend, Scott Burkham. You know Scott, I assume.
Yep, I know Scott.
Yeah. So Scott was teaching a course on design at Microsoft, and he decided to move on to do other things, and he asked for volunteers, and for some reason I can't entirely explain, I volunteered to teach what was known as UI design basics at Microsoft for about 3 years. And that just pure through accident got me involved in UX design training. So when I left Microsoft in 2010, I started UX Design Edge, and so I'm focused on helping teams, primarily technical teams, software development teams that don't really have a traditional UX design culture. I help them learn how to do their best work through design training as well as consulting. And that's pretty much where we are now. So I've been doing this for about 8 years. Oh,
Well,
one more thing. Quick note, Joe. For whatever reason, I was looking at my bookshelf the other day, and I found this. I don't know if you recognize this, but it is the Merit Award awarded to me for guidelines-based user experience design, signed by none other than Joe Welinske.
Wow, that goes back a ways. I was president of STC, local chapter at that point. All right. Well, it's always interesting to hear people's stories, how you end up getting to where you're at, and a lot of times you're just following a path that isn't what you necessarily thought you were going to be following along. Was there anything aspirational or particularly interesting about getting involved more on the user interface design side, having come out of that, maybe a more technical programmer environment?
Well, I think
Did it just feel good, or was something about the challenge particularly interesting?
well, exactly. So just getting involved from my background, kind of the incentives were, first, the realization how incredibly important it was. Second, realizing that I wasn't very good at it. And also, to a large degree, also realizing that not anybody else was all that good at it at the time. So I've been at this for, quite a while. So I'm talking about, the early 2000 and before time frame where, most UIs just weren't that good. And so just realizing that this is something that isn't well understood, and really putting a lot of effort into understanding it, primarily for my own personal satisfaction, but also, it really did help out in my career because I had some deep thinking on things. So, for example, writing guidelines, they didn't choose me to do that because I'm a fantastic writer, although I think I am a fantastic writer. But it was, just the fact that I was able to clearly explain how to make often very basic design decisions to a technical audience. So, your kind of classic question might be, should I use a checkbox versus 2 radio buttons? And to be able to explain that in a very authoritative way, surprisingly, is a rare skill. Very often people will say, well, it depends. Okay, what does it depend on? Well, it depends on a lot of things. Okay, great, that doesn't help me. Or somebody will say, well, does anybody have any usability research as to which one I should use? And the answer, of course, is no, because that's not what user researchers do. Just kind of being involved in these kind of conversations and just kind of being surprised to discover that I'm able to explain them in a way that's helpful and authoritative was just kind of a surprise. It wasn't, so none of this was planned is kind of the bottom line. It was all accidental.
But you did mention in there that you had one stepping stone was being involved in developing the experience guidelines, and so being someone that's always been involved in that area, I definitely don't underestimate the effort and the skill it takes to be able to put together something like that. But it sounds like that was one of the formative parts of you getting involved in this.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing about guidelines is it's very easy to do bad guidelines, but very, very difficult to do good ones. It's surprisingly challenging. Yeah, I think that, the bad guidelines is kind of like the random collection of do's and don'ts. It's like, okay, why do I care about this stuff? It's not the, so actually I'll just share one more insight here about guidelines that's kind of interesting. And that is, when I was working on the guidelines, one thing I realized was that, basically every set of guidelines had kind of a story behind it. And it's not like, story like, Bob has a problem, Bob discovers radio buttons, Bob is happy sort of story. What I'm saying is that, there's a story of radio buttons. Why do radio buttons exist? What's their purpose? And how are they different from the various alternatives? And the surprise that I learned was that it really kind of boils down to effective human communication. Which is what led to the whole UI as communication book that I previously wrote, is just realizing that you can explain pretty much anything about UI design in terms of how to best communicate to your target audience. That's really all it is a form of human communication. And of course, user assistance is used to thinking that way. And to a large degree, I think the modern trend that we're dealing with today is realizing that these are not separate things. These are the same thing, that the UI is the best way of communicating to users as opposed to some separate document and infrastructure that answers these questions.
Well, things certainly have evolved significantly over the past 10 years or so. I know you're always busy doing new things and always having new thoughts about how to improve what we do. So are there any particular things that you're particularly passionate about right now?
Well, you might have heard about my new book. So of course that is source of passion. It's called Intuitive Design, 8 Steps to an Intuitive UI. And so I've really been focusing on intuitive UI, and this really is a major theme in both my presentations at Writers UA East, is that, modern UIs need to be intuitive, but the interesting surprise is that we don't really understand what that means. And I say that because I ask people, if somebody says, oh, this is intuitive, or no, it's not, if somebody naturally brings it up in a conversation, when appropriate, I'll pin them down and actually try to get them to define what they mean by intuitive. And, you would think that given the amount of time we spend talking about this thing, that this would be a concept that everybody has nailed down. And the surprise is we don't really know what intuitive means, quite frankly. And so, like, when I do this exercise, I get a range of answers. Very often, the most common answer I think I'll get is most people will define intuitive to mean familiar. Kind of suggesting that if we make our designs more familiar, they therefore will be more intuitive. Turns out that's not really what it's all about. Familiarity can be kind of an indirect factor, but whether or not something is familiar or not doesn't necessarily mean it's intuitive. And my exhibit A in this claim is that take a look at Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things. That could be easily retitled The Design of Familiar Things, and he explores why it is that familiar things like door handles and light switches aren't intuitive. And the reason is that they're missing various attributes. So that's what I'm calling the 8 steps of intuitive UI. It needs to have the right combination of all these 8 attributes. And if anything's missing, like discoverability, affordance, or comprehensibility, what that means is it's not going to be intuitive. And so the great thing about having this framework is that we're able to assess whether or not a design is intuitive or not simply by applying a framework, as opposed to the more traditional approach of usability testing. And I'm not, of course, in any way suggesting that we shouldn't test our designs, but I am suggesting that our design process and our testing process will be a whole lot more effective if we're able to find the easy things on our own.
Well, one of the things that I'm always thinking about is how intuitive applies to the spectrum of natural complexity that there might be in a product. And I think, well, personally, I think about the intuitiveness of a basic app that I might have on my smartphone in a different way from my expectations for something that's intuitive, that's part of a more complex business model in, say, an enterprise setting. If you have any thoughts related to that in terms of maybe different ways or similar ways to think about what's intuitive depending on the complexity of our product or service?
Well, that's actually a fantastic segue into what led me to propose my talks for Writers UA, especially the one with the Lighthouse projects. So let me just work that through a little bit. So here's the interesting thing. So I'm making the claim that we need to make our designs more intuitive, and I would suggest that the marketplace is certainly demonstrating that. We have a new generation of users who have never read a user's manual in their life and are unlikely to do so. But when I make claims like this to my customers, a lot of my clients have what I would describe as serious apps. They're very powerful, complex legacy apps that might be 10, 20 years old. They have an enormous amount of capability and therefore require an enormous amount of documentation and training in order to use. And so the claim will be, that's fine for a website, but our app is designed for highly trained professionals. You just can't walk up and use this app. So my daughter, for example, is going through this right now with SolidWorks. She's a mechanical engineer trying to learn SolidWorks. And, just having this burden of having to learn this incredibly difficult application in order to get things done makes it very, very difficult to really get any headway. And I personally have the same experience with pretty much every Adobe product. I've been trying to learn Photoshop for 20 years and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But here's the interesting thing, and that is, this claim that, your product can't be made intuitive works really well at the high level, abstract level. You can say that and it's very hard to argue with. But the interesting challenge is to try it with specific UI. So it's like, okay, show me an example of a UI in your product that you think cannot be made either intuitive or alternatively reduce the amount of documentation and training required to use it. And let's just work it through and see if that really is true. And the surprise is how often, almost always, that's the case, that it can be made much more intuitive or require much less documentation and training. While I appreciate the challenge that these powerful apps have, I think we have a tendency to assume that it's impossible and therefore not even try, when in fact it's actually very possible if we do try. And that's kind of the problem, is convincing ourselves that it's even possible in the first place and even giving it a serious effort. It's very, very difficult to find an example of a UI that's better off being unintuitive.
Well, you mentioned, you alluded to that I kind of led into a discussion about your topics at the conference, but let's just bring those up. And one of the topics is user assistance in modern apps, and the other title is UX Persuasion with Lighthouse Examples. So maybe give a little bit of background about what your thinking was in putting those together and what people can expect to hear about.
Right, exactly. So, kind of the core of my thinking that applies to both of these talks is basically boils down to what I've kind of previously mentioned, which is that we have a new generation of users and that we have different expectations today, that, we're walking around with great user experiences in our pockets. We're kind of expecting those same easy to use, intuitive experiences on all our stuff. And so, I think that the world has changed. We're kind of coming out of this classic, what I describe as RTFM world, where it was kind of the expectation that if you wanted to use a product, you had to use the user manual, you had to have the training in order to use it. We're kind of leaving that world and entering a world where customers expect things to be intuitive. So I'm kind of taking that core concept and stretching it in two directions. So the first direction I'm stretching it is basically user assistance for modern apps. So specifically like mobile apps. So what is documentation, user assistance training? What does that mean in this intuitively designed world? So we've got that mobile app that we've just installed from the App Store. What are we expecting to see in user assistance there? And so kind of the modern way of doing user assistance very often is done in terms of what I'd call coach marks as well as onboarding. And so very often you'll see one form or the other. But the interesting thing about both of those is that very often what they do is they reveal design flaws. So just asking the basic question with the onboarding, so if the onboarding is explaining how to use the app, the question is, can we change the design to make that onboarding unnecessary? And of course the answer isn't always no, but it very often is no. That very often what we can do is, add a label or add a word or, add an affordance or do something where a lot of the onboarding and coach marks are not really necessary. But I am not in any way suggesting that we don't need documentation or we don't need onboarding or user assistance in modern apps, but I'm saying that the focus is changing. The focus is moving from explaining the unintuitive UI to really delivering immediate value to our users. And that's really, I think, the future of modern user assistance is so, go ahead and have the onboarding, but make sure it's focused on helping me understand how your app is going to deliver immediate value to me. And if you do that, that's the right thing. Whereas if by contrast you're explaining how stuff works, that's basically revealing design flaws.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to give us a little introduction to the new things that you're working on. And I only saw a flash of your book cover. Why don't you just kind of get it up here and let's take a look at that.
Joe, I do want to mention that I didn't talk about the Lighthouse example one. If you don't mind.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. So the other talk is UX Persuasion through Lighthouse examples. And what's interesting about this is actually inspired by a workshop that I did with a user assistance team. And so the interesting thing about that workshop is, unlike my traditional workshop where we're trying to learn how to design stuff and come up with a final design and evaluate it for usability, what we wanted to do for the user assistance team who don't have that responsibility, what I wanted to do for them is help them basically play a more active role in the design process to eliminate the need for documentation. And so the thinking there is, the output of this is not to come up with a design, but rather to make a persuasive case to the software team on how to redesign or better design the product to eliminate the need for documentation in the first place. And what was interesting about that is, so I gave what I'm calling the 7 levels of persuasion. And what was interesting is the bottom level, the least persuasive technique, is personal opinion. Right. And so the thing is, when they did the exercise, and so I said, basically assume I'm going to be the manager who wants to say no to everything. So, persuade me to say yes, persuade me to change my mind here and actually make this change. And so, I explained that, persuasive, or the least persuasive, I should say, is personal opinion. And I also pointed out that hypotheticals are very unpersuasive. And it was interesting that most teams would start with basically the assertion along the lines of, we think that we can design this better, which is personal opinion about a hypothetical. And so, in order to change somebody's mind, especially someone who's absolutely convinced that making the product intuitive is impossible, the very best way of doing that is through example. And so that's what the lighthouse concept is all about, is being able to, when appropriate, work with your team to come up with examples to persuade them that we can design our apps better so that they are less dependent upon documentation and training. And in this context, I would define a lighthouse as basically, some sort of model, some sort of benchmark that establishes a benchmark for both quality as well as feasibility. So if you want to convince your team that something is actually possible when everybody's convinced it's not, there's no better way of doing that than with a simple example.
Well, I'm glad we got that part of it in as well, because it's definitely part of our program. And again, if you just want to pop your book up for a minute, we make sure we get a...
Okay. Here we go. Very good. So, so it's called Intuitive Design, 8 Steps to an Intuitive UI. And you might have noticed the cover, the duck labeled not a duck. And so, the idea behind this is, actually it's inspired by, of course, the phrase, the expression, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So that's kind of an intuitive way in which people recognize things. They see a familiar pattern and they have expectations based on the pattern. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to try to visualize an unintuitive duck? And of course, ducks are pretty darn intuitive. So, the interesting observation is very often we stick labels on things to explain how they work. And so the idea is, well, let's have an unintuitive duck by having a label saying it's not really a duck after all. So that's kind of what it's all about.
Well, thanks again, and we'll see you in a few months in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for the opportunity, and I'm very much looking forward to the conference.